Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Everyone, and welcome to episode 55 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. This week, we're continuing my interview with writer, editor, professor Evan Skolnick, who has had a career in both comics and video games over the years. As I mentioned in part 1, I'm going to be releasing this interview in parts, each episode focusing on a different portion of his working life, keeping to a weekly schedule instead of my usual every other week until all the parts have been released. In this section, we dive into Evan's time as a writer at Marvel, focusing quite a bit on his 2-year run as the writer of New Warriors. It was episode 53 dedicated to the team that brought my work to Evan's attention and prompted him to volunteer for this interview. This section is a little longer than my normal episodes, so let's get started. Let's get into some of your writing. When you first started, you were doing, little annuals here and there, and then you also did some licensed properties like RoboCop, NFL Super Pro, Tech World. Working with a license holder like that, did you have any extra restrictions or other level of approval you had to go through?
Yes, you do. And I worked on licensed material not only as a writer, but as an editor, as an assistant editor, especially working with Sid Jacobson in the Star Comics office. All that material was licensed. And then when Sid left and Fabian Nicieza moved from the marketing promotion side to editorial, he took over Sid's job as editor there. And so we were an editorial team, and we worked on all kinds of editorial material there, like Barbie comics. And it varied from licensor to licensor how smooth and easy that process was. Usually it was pretty rough at the beginning with a new licensor. You were often dealing with someone who was not a creative on the other end. You were dealing with a person who was hired to protect the license.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we would find often was these people, it was one of those, if you have to ask, the answer is going to be no, if you want to do something. Because their biggest fear was putting something out that would get them fired.
Right. And
so they would present the most conservative possible response to everything at first. And what we'd often see happen is, we'd put that first issue out after much agita and gnashing of teeth, and they wouldn't get fired. And then we'd put out another issue, and they wouldn't get fired. And then over time, we would try to push the envelope, and they would find that they didn't get fired. And so eventually they would go, okay, I can trust these people. And the reins would be loosened a bit, slackened a bit, and you would have a little more leeway in many cases to explore creative material. But it's one of the hardest things to do was do a really good licensed comic book back then, because it was so hard to get on the same page with the license holder and the people who were actually in charge of you. One of the license series that you didn't read that I wrote was Terminator 2. Because we came to a total logjam with the license holder, and we were not willing to make the changes they wanted us to make. And they were not willing to budge. And in the end, it never came out. It was actually my big break at Marvel was that series. And in fact, it was going to be Joe Quesada's first first monthly book.
Oh, wow.
And he did this amazing, yeah, he was this up and coming artist, penciler, and he did this amazing Terminator money shot I was like, I can't wait to work with this guy, and it was to the point where I'd written the plot for the first double-sized issue and had a whole series planned out for it. And we wanted to have the kind of same tone and, feeling of the movies. And we just the licensor had a very different idea of what a Terminator 2 comic book series should be, and it got kind of silly. So yeah, it can be very much different can of worms when you're dealing with a licensed property versus one that like Marvel owned.
Oh, that's a shame, because I can picture a Joe Quesada T-1000 in my head, and I'm sure it just would have looked amazing. Yeah, I would have loved to see your take on that.
I know. It's funny. Before this interview, I kind of dug through my old files, and I'm literally looking at the proposal I wrote right now, and it still kind of kills me because, when I tell people about the stories and the whole concept, it's one of those things that they act like, oh, if only. But eventually, Marvel did put out some Terminator comics that were great by other folks, but it's one of those things that they just wanted something more focused toward kids. They thought, comic books are for kids, and let's make this for young kids. And we're like, no, this should feel like your movies, and we want to have Terminators, we want to have time travel, we want to have people shooting. And they're like, no, you shouldn't use time travel. We're like, what? that's like the core of you've done 2 movies. They both have time travel. That's 100%.
Wow.
But so it was, yeah. And this another, it was kind of like on the same lines as when I worked on the RoboCop comic as the assistant editor. And at some point they asked us if we could stop having RoboCop shoot people. It's like you pay, the Marvel pays for this license because it's popular.
And then they want to change everything that makes it popular.
They don't want to let you do yeah, exactly. So, it's like I said, usually with these relationships, it starts off kind of like that to one degree or another. And then over time, you find that there's a relaxation, and then you can really start to do some cool stuff. But often there's a lot of trepidation on the licensor's part at first. And, they are the guardians of the IP. So I can understand that, but at the same time, it at times was very frustrating as a creator.
Well, I understand you had a much more positive situation with Tech World.
That was great. Yeah, that was so William Shatner's Tech War novels had been coming out. This was, again, the early 90s. And this was when I was working with Fabian and his brother Mariano Nicieza had managed to make a connection with William Shatner about these books. And so in the end, we ended up doing a Tech World comic book series, and it was in our editorial office. I had pitched to write it, but Mr. Shatner wanted to have his writing consultant, Ron Goulart, who had, let's say, helped with the novels, which he had thanked very heavily in the novels, was the writer on the comic book series. So I ended up coloring it and being the assistant editor on it for coloring the first 3 or 4 issues, I think. And then I was overwhelmed with my workload, so it was handed off. But then eventually there was just a dissatisfaction with the writing on the series, and I think Fabian made the difficult decision to propose replacing Ron Goulart with someone, and someone ended up being me. So it was really cool because for me, at least, it wasn't cool for everybody involved, of course, but I felt very fortunate. And what was fun about it was that the artist, Lee Sullivan, who is a friend of mine from the UK, he and I were invited to go up to Toronto to visit the set of the Tech War TV series they were shooting up there. Because they were shooting this TV series, we wanted to kind of match the look of the comic book to whatever they were doing there. So we wanted to see the production design and whatnot. And that was just an amazing experience because, we got there. We're both huge Star Trek fans, huge William Shatner fans, trying not to fanboy out because it's a professional relationship we're trying to instill. And we get there and they're get ready to shoot a scene, and he's directing it. And he didn't realize we were there. And we were kind of sitting toward the back, trying to stay out of the way of everybody, because on a movie set or TV set, it's very, a lot of people doing important things and you don't want to get in their way. And eventually he found out we had been there the whole time. He's like, "What are you guys doing? Hey," and he said, "Hello, call me Bill, have a seat." And he started describing the scene they were shooting and asked our opinions as to how he was framing it. And from that moment on, it was just a wonderful couple of days up there, watching them shoot different scenes. And he took us to dinner. So I'm sitting across the table from like one of my idols, just one of those great moments that you just don't anticipate happening, but they do. So that was a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds great. Now, in addition to your editorial duties, I understand you also played on and eventually became the manager of the company's softball team.
Oh yeah, Marvel softball.
What was that like, and who were some of the stars of the lineup?
Oh, it's been a while. I mean, we used to play. We played every summer in Central Park, and we were in a league with mostly other publishing companies, I think. The only one we really cared about beating was DC Comics, right? This was the big rivalry.
Yeah, of course.
And I think they called themselves the DC Batmen, which, makes sense. I played for a while, and I think 1 or 2 years I was the coach, and it was fun. It was a great way to kind of bond with your fellow Marvelites and also to have a friendly rivalry with the folks on the other side. I know that my name became a verb because I'm not the best softball player, not the worst either, but I always threw myself into it, and I literally would throw myself onto the ground all kinds of plays. I would dive for the ball all over the place and maybe get it half the time if I'm lucky. And to kind of go over the top with trying to make a play was to Skolnick something. That became a thing. I remember Fabian was one of our more passionate players, and he was there for almost every game, I'd say, and when he could, because he was doing so many things at once. For a while there, he was editing full time, and he was writing a bunch of X books, and I don't know how he did it. And I know that one time he actually he sprained his thumb
Ooh.
while playing. I wasn't at the game, but he had to go to the ER, and he's apparently was waiting in the ER with a potentially broken thumb, and he's got his laptop and he's writing like X-Men scripts with his good hand while waiting to be seen by the doctor. Like, this is the work ethic that Fabian had. How could I compete with that kind of work ethic? I couldn't. But yeah, we'd have a softball end of the year softball barbecue. But there was 1 year where the rivalry really heated up between us and DC, and we brought like these big posters showing the sales figures of ours versus DC. Like the people who were, because sometimes people would come to watch the game,
right,
and they were like waving them to kind of taunt the opposition, our distinguished competition. In terms of who won the games, I'm pretty sure it was pretty even most of the time, but it was good fun.
Yeah, sounds like. So you've mentioned Fabian a number of times now, and you worked with him in editorial for some time. Did that working relationship end up helping you with getting the New Warriors writing gig, or did that actually kind of hold you back in some ways?
Fabian was and is a very good friend. And there was, at Marvel at that time, there was quite a bit of perceived nepotism between friends at Marvel. So people, would, and this went all the way up and down the chain. People who had the ability to greenlight a series would give it to their friends because they deserved it, as opposed to because they had the best ideas. That would happen sometimes, and there was a perception of that, and there were other editors there who really did not want that perception, who didn't want to do that. And I was one of those people, and I know that Fabian was too, and Tom Brevoort, who was the new editor on New Warriors at that time, he had just taken it over recently at that time when Fabian announced that he was going to leave the series after issue 53. And Tom and I were good friends and still are. And so he was very concerned with the perception of hiring a good friend to write this series. So he sent out, as editors would do, a call for proposals to a select number of people he wanted to hear from.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked if I could pitch as well, and he said, yes, you can pitch. But I think he did say, or certainly I got the impression that he was concerned about the appearance of it if I were to get it. But he still let me pitch. So pitch I did. And it's funny, as I said, I was looking through my old proposals, some of the ones I found, and the only one I couldn't find, or at least one, was my New Warriors proposal. But I found so many others. I pitched so many series, Kurt, I'm telling you, and so much work, and so many of them did not end up getting it. But this one got through, and what Tom told me afterward, once he had decided, was that he got some heavy hitters to pitch for this series. But what he said was, and I'm not directly quoting, but he basically gave me the impression that I was the only person who seemed like they didn't want to destroy the New Warriors. In other words, I liked the book, I liked the characters, and I didn't want to change the tone of it. I didn't want to make it dark. I didn't want to wipe out the team or otherwise change the tone of it. I loved what Fabian had done, and I wanted to try to continue in the same spirit. And I got the impression that the other people who had pitched didn't seem like they were as focused on that. So in the end, that's how I got it. Tom basically hired me to do it, even despite the fact that he knew that the appearance might be that he hired his buddy. So I think, if anything, he was probably maybe harsher on me than he might have been if we hadn't been friends. I don't know, but certainly I know that there was probably some concern of how it would look, and he didn't want to be one of those editors at Marvel who hires their buddies.
So it sounds like you kind of got the job in spite of your friendship rather than because of it.
I would say that's fair. Certainly, I certainly know it didn't work in my favor. I know for a fact that Tom wouldn't do that, and so I felt good about having gotten it because I felt like I had earned it. If I really did think that Tom was like the kind of person who would go, "Hey, you're my friend," yeah, that wouldn't have felt as much of an achievement. But I know without a doubt that he is not that kind of person, and would only have selected my proposal if he felt it was the best one for what he wanted to see.
Now, speaking of your proposal, I understand that it was pretty different from how it actually ended up. Can you talk about some of those differences and why you ended up abandoning that original pitch?
Yeah, I mean, this happens a lot, right? So the pitch is kind of your own vision of what you want to do, but then when an editor comes into it, they have to be thinking maybe bigger picture and they have their own opinion as to what the series should be. And my proposal, basically did kind of graduate most of the team. With the exception of Nova and Speedball, I felt the other team members basically within Fabian's run had completed their journeys as new, young, untested, rough and ready young heroes. I wanted to focus on some new characters, and I felt that Speedball and Nova were the ones that still had quite a bit yet to develop and learn. So my proposal had basically phased out, had basically graduated, not killed, but kind of graduated the other team members in favor of some new team members, and some of the ones that had come in recently, such as Powerhouse, I called them, and Turbo. And then I was going to bring in the characters who eventually became Time Slip and Helix. So that was going to be the team. Nova was going to be in charge. And I didn't feel like it would be a New Warriors book without Speedball. So that was going to be the team when I pitched it. But again, the editor has to come in and think bigger picture maybe, and certainly has ideas as to what is kind of bedrock for this series. And Tom definitely felt that I shouldn't get rid of Justice or Firestar. So I basically graduated the other team members and slowly worked in my own creations to put my own stamp on it and kind of have some new characters that were brand new to the series. And then, of course, on top of that, through the kind of the convulsions that Marvel was going through at that time with the sales starting to slip, the books being moved from group to group, and the New Warriors, the X-Men titles becoming their own group of books under its own editor-in-chief, and all the horror and type titles, Midnight Suns, right? So New Warriors didn't really have there wasn't like a Marvel Universe group, and so New Warriors ended up being pushed into the Spider-Man group, which wasn't really an intuitive fit. But so in other words, outside forces were having an impact on the kind of stories we could tell, the kind of characters we were going to have in the book. And so the closer you get to one of the larger IPs at Marvel, the more you're going to be buffeted by other forces. And so, I was able to use some of the stories that I had thought of in that proposal, but most of them did not get used. And I ended up having to come up with new ideas that fit with the different things that were happening in the book and then, of course, around the book.
One of those big things that you had to work around was maximum clonage. What's it like when you have a big kind of event like that and you have to work your scripts in to match what other writers are doing?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I watched Fabian dealing with this all the time, years earlier when I'd be a fly on the wall or a person in the desk next to him while he was, thinking about how to navigate working as an X-Men group writer, right? Because those books were, very much interwoven, seemed like they were always in the middle of a new crossover. And like, where did he get a chance to write the stories he actually wanted to write, as opposed to bridging from one part of a crossover to another? And so I began to get a sense of that firsthand with New Warriors, and it wasn't as extreme, as it was with what he was dealing with. But it definitely, like for example, we want to get Scarlet Spider in the group, so let's make that happen to make sure that it feels like it belongs in the Spider-Man universe. Or let's get directly involved in the maximum clonage or the aftermath that happened there. And so you're writing pieces of a story, and I was kind of being brought more and more into the Spider-Man family of writers. I was kind of the guy they would turn to if one of the writers of the 4 main series was too busy to handle a special project or a fill-in or something. So I was kind of like in the on-deck circle, I felt like, for Spider-Man, more Spider-Man work. So yeah, it was definitely a different way of writing. We'd have these retreats, when the whole group would go off to off-site for a day, like a convention center, or more likely, like a getaway out in the woods, where we could sit and at around a table and kind of hammer through the big beats of the crossover, and then figure out individually what happens in each issue, and then you'd go back with a couple of lines about what happens in your issue, and then you'd have to go write it, and the editors would have the challenge of stitching it all together as best they could. So a very different kind of writing than just writing your own series that's kind of more or less in isolation.
How far in advance were you plotting the book at that point when you started and up till the end?
I don't know if I remember exactly how far, but I know that I always had at least 6 months worth of ideas ready to go, but then you had to kind of be ready to shift them or delay them or not do them at all, depending on other considerations, usually having to do with continuity, especially once we got into the Spider-Man group of titles. There were things that were starting to affect us, but then we were able to kind of break away toward the last part of my run was relatively free of those kind of encumbrances. And I had ideas, that were going to take the series well beyond issue 75, and we're going to shake things up again for the team. But one of the nice things about the way the series ended was that we had quite a bit of advance notice that it was going to end.
That's actually what I was going to ask next, is how far in advance did you know that?
At least 3 or 4 issues. I was moving things in one direction toward a big space-based, galactic storyline, and then I had to pivot that to being the ending storyline. I was able to salvage quite a bit of what I wanted to do, but certainly had to repurpose it to be not so much an opening to a new chapter, but the closing of the book. Mm-hmm. So, it was nice that we had that, even though it was frustrating that the book was being canceled. Because one of the things one of the advantages I had as a writer who was also an editor was that we actually got the sales figures every month. So we knew exactly how our books were selling. And New Warriors was outselling a number of other books that did not get canceled at that time. So it was a bit frustrating on that to have that information. But, the other books that I'm talking about had bigger name characters perhaps, and maybe had licensing deals in place that stipulated that there had to be a monthly comic book. So there may have been other reasons that was the case. But when the book was canceled, it was probably selling better than most comic books sell today. But this was the 90s. So
right.
But yeah, it was good that they gave us enough warning to close it out the way we wanted to close it out, as opposed to it just ending abruptly.
My own 2 cents here. I loved the way you ended the book, where it did have a finality to it, but at the same time felt like the team was there and that they could be easily picked right back up and find out what they're doing next.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I mean, that's what I felt was the right thing to do for that team. I had a very warm spot in my heart for that team, and I didn't want to, again, say that I had the same attitude leaving it as I had coming in, which was that I had a lot of respect for what Fabian and Mark Bagley and then later Derek Robertson had done, with that series. And so I never wanted to shatter it. I never wanted to break it. And I feel like later iterations maybe didn't have that same feeling toward the book, but certainly I had that feeling. So yeah, I wanted to leave it not exactly where I had found it, but I wanted to leave it on a positive note and kind of put a button on it, and yet open the door for someone to potentially pick up in future years and leave the door open for that. Yeah.
And now you just mentioned Mark Bagley and Derek Robertson as the first 2 artists on there. You had one artist for almost the entirety of your run, just 1 issue with Richard Pace, and then Patrick Zurcher joined the creative team. Mm-hmm. Do you, as the writer for a long-term book, do you have any say in choosing that penciler?
No, you don't.
Okay.
Yeah, and the first issue with Richard Pace was definitely a misfit between the two of us, and he had already, I think, decided to leave at that point. So no, but I was so thrilled to work with Patrick, with Pat, and I'm pretty sure, as I recall, it's been a while, but I'm pretty sure it's Zerker.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's okay.
that's good to know.
Yeah, but it was such a great relationship we had. We never actually got to meet in person during that whole run, but we talked on the phone a lot, and he just had such a great ability to even back then, because I know he's still active and continues to improve his craft. But even back then, we get the pages back, I'd be so thrilled. This was during a time when the main way to write comic books, the format we used was the Marvel method, which was plot and then script.
Mm-hmm.
Most comic books these days, I believe, are written what we would call the DC method, or full script. So the difference being that in a Marvel plot, you'd write out what happens in the story, with a vague suggestion as to how many pages everything would take. You say pages 1 to 2, this stuff happens. Page 3, full page spread of this, and then page 4 and 5, this stuff happens. And then it's up to the penciler to also with no dialogue in there, or just maybe placeholder stuff.
Right.
And then the penciler is the one who determines how many panels per page and what camera angles and whatnot. And then those pencils would come back to the writer, and then I would look at them. Then I would write the dialogue based on what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more of a collaborative process with the writer, with the artist having more of an impact on the visual storytelling. And Pat was so good at that, and still is. But I'm just saying, during my time working with him, I found his work to come back, and I was just always so thrilled with what he had done, and would often put little details in the background that I hadn't requested, but I would love. It was a great relationship, and like I said, we were on the phone a lot, talking about stuff. He would have questions, or he'd have an idea. He said, "Hey, I was thinking of doing this. What do you think?" And so it was a really positive, healthy working relationship, and I was very fortunate that he stayed with the title right to the end, because it allowed for us to have a good synergy going.
Definitely. Now, you brought in a few new characters into the book. Did Patrick help with the look of those, or did you have those already pretty set in mind when you...
Yeah, those were both, the visuals on those were pure Patrick. The late, great Mark Grunwald, who I loved working with when I was able to do so at Marvel, and still miss him to this day. But he created these, or had these character sheets created. They were printed on full-size comic book cardstock, and they had these light blue outlines, kind of like Marvel Universe style, front, back, and side, that you could draw over. So if you had an idea for a costume and you were a writer, but you were a writer who couldn't draw to save their life, you could still sketch out kind of what you were thinking and kind of give it as a suggestion to an artist.
Okay.
And I would do that sometimes. I did that with like the Tracer that I co-created for the Deathlock annual, when all the new characters were being created in '93. But for Time Slip and Helix, I didn't do that. I just would describe who the person was and what they were about, and I didn't really have a visual per se in mind for the costume. And so in those particular cases, Patrick just kind of went with it, and he did such a great job with the designs, especially Time Slip. I love the outfit he gave her. I think it's fantastic. That's why we say the characters were co-created.
Right.
Because even though many times the writer comes to the table with the idea and the name and the powers, and maybe even a sketch of the look, the artist has to come in and put that stamp on it, which is so important, the visual stamp. So yeah, these are characters that I co-created with Pat.
And now Time Slip, that kind of adds another wrinkle to your writing challenges. You had her kind of quantum leap into her own past and future. And what was it like trying to, fit that in with the other restrictions you had, the other challenges of doing a monthly book with editorial and the Spider-Man and then just trying to fit in this time travel element to it as well?
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned, what you're probably referring to is the flash forward element of the character,
mm-hmm.
where she's seeing things that are going to happen in the future, or actually experiencing them herself. Right, so her power was to swap her consciousness with a future version of herself, and vice versa. And so I brought her in pretty early in my run, and with the kind of naive assumption that I was going to be able to to write the stories that I want to write, because I hadn't really anticipated the kind of heavy interactions the book was going to have with the rest of the Marvel Universe. So it definitely became interesting when I would put a stake in the ground saying, this is going to happen in the future of this comic book. This panel that you're seeing here, it's going to happen. Certainly for Speedball's apparent death, that was something that I had already plotted everything out for. So I knew how that was going to roll out. But there was a point where she was kind of grasping at straws, looking into the future. And I described a whole montage of different things she had seen. And these were more like, best guesses, or just leaving doors open for myself that I eventually would try to match up, right? So at some point, I knew that we were going to have Garth and Saul become Nova. And so, I dropped a panel of Garth and Saul as Nova, blasting Nova Force out in all directions, and Turbo looking like she's being blasted by it. And that was my intention, that they were going to fight Garth and Saul.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came time for that storyline to happen, I didn't have that scene. That scene did not exist. It didn't need to exist. So I had to change the actual reality of it so that he was using his power to slow her down so she didn't break her neck. It was the same panel. So sometimes I had to kind of wriggle around my own lack of foresight and kind of find a way to still match up with those flash forwards that she had. But it was fun. I mean, it was fun because one of the things I had stipulated with the character is whatever she sees happen in the future does happen. Like, there's none of this like alternate timeline thing. If she sees it, that means it's going to happen. So the question becomes, is what she sees happening really what's happening? That's what I had to end up having to kind of fall back on with Speedball's apparent death and then other things like that too.
Mm-hmm. And then there's another character you created that was already in the book when you started, and that was Turbo. I've, of course, have read issue 73 and the text piece at the end.
Yeah.
But for those who haven't, can you tell a little bit about the history of that character and getting him / her into the Marvel Universe?
Yeah, that was kind of a running joke for a very long time. Like I said earlier, when I first got to Marvel, I was very interested in writing for Marvel Comics, and I wanted to create characters for Marvel. I wanted to do new stuff, which is not the way to really approach it when you first get to Marvel. They're not going to risk having your first story also be a brand new character as well. It's just and certainly not in a new series. So I was kind of barking up the wrong tree, and I was working with Dwight Coy, who at the time was the art returns manager. So all the original artwork that was used to create the comics was shipped back to Marvel, and it was returned to the artists, the pencilers, and the inkers in a certain proportion. And someone had to manage that huge amount of material, and so that was what Dwight did. He and I were kind of pals. And James Brock, who was in one of Romita's Raiders, the art corrections department. It's basically up-and-coming pencilers and artists who would go in and make corrections to existing art boards rather than ship it back to the artist for a slight change. So the three of us kind of got together and began working on this proposal to do a Torpedo revival, which is an old Daredevil villain, basically, or was a villain, and the suit would change hands. And Dwight was like, I want to do a Torpedo series. Let's pitch a Torpedo series. And I was like, okay, who's the Torpedo? I had no idea, and I wasn't one of these folks who were at Marvel who were basically walking encyclopedias of Marvel Universe knowledge. I had decent knowledge, but it wasn't comprehensive. So he showed me the Marvel Universe Book of the Dead because the character had died. And I looked at it, I was like, oh my God, that is the goofiest suit I've ever seen. It's very silly looking. If we're going to do this, we're going to make it a comedy. We're going to have fun with this. He was like, okay. And then James was like, I've always wanted to do a series where two people are sharing a super suit and they're fighting over who's going to wear it, who's going to use it. So we brought that in as well. And eventually I said, well, I don't think we should call it Torpedo because it sounds kind of old. And I suggested we call it Turbo. And we pitched it like over and over and over. And, we just couldn't make any headway with it. And it kind of became this running joke at Marvel that because we wanted to do a light, fun teen superhero book because that didn't really exist at Marvel at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like Teen Titans, but with just a couple of characters. Well, while we were pitching all this, that's when New Warriors was decided would happen. Basically, you may have read the backstory on that. It's kind of an editorial decision to make a book like this, and they just kind of flipped through the Marvel Universe handbook and picked a few characters that weren't being used, that were young, and then decided to try to have people pitch to write it. And of course, Fabian, got it, did a fantastic job with it. So as we're pitching this, Fabian's doing this fantastic book that is exactly the kind of book we were talking about doing. And doing it much better than we could have as well, on top of on top of everything else. So the argument for our Turbo series was feeling weaker and weaker. And then at some point, I think around, I don't know, it was in the 20s, late 20s, early 30s of the New Warriors run, Fabian wanted to expand the team. And he said, I like the Turbo idea. How do you feel about me bringing the characters into the series and introducing them there? And so we said, yeah, okay. And so that's kind of how. So both the Turbo characters got introduced in New Warriors by Fabian, and then once they were in that book, they were officially in the Marvel Universe, and then we could then pitch like backup stories and whatnot for annuals and whatnot. It was a bit hard to have someone else introduce our characters to the Marvel Universe, but it got done. And so that's one of the reasons why once I came on board, I wanted to make Turbo much more prominent because, I was a bit attached to the characters.
Oh, understandable. You said you saw it as kind of a lighthearted comedy. So I'm guessing that the death of Mike then was not part of your original story plan with the Turbo character. Was that a hard decision to make when you got to that point in the story?
It wasn't a difficult decision because it was clear to me there was never going to be a Turbo series. And I wanted something big to happen, around that time of the series as we were closing out. I wanted something very dramatic to happen and kind of shocking. So I felt the most comfortable killing a character that I helped co-create as opposed to killing someone else's character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
So it was hard to do, and yet, I felt like the right thing to do. From the very beginning of the two Turbo characters, Mickey was always the most popular.
Well, and she was also the better she was also the better superhero. She was
right, but yeah, but she didn't want to be. I mean, that was supposed to be the humor of the series, is that you've got this one kid who's a total comic book nerd, knows all the heroes, all their superpowers, and he wants to be one, and he gives away the suit to someone else who doesn't want it, doesn't care about it, doesn't want to be a hero, and doesn't know anything about this whole life. And on top of that, she's much better at it, at using the suit. So that was part of the whole bit that we were gonna do. But originally, she was just like a side character, and he was the main character. But as we began to work up these short demo sample treatments on the series, people would gravitate toward Mickey, and so we realized that was the more popular character. So we began leaning more toward focusing more on her.
I really loved the idea in issue 75 of it continuing with her and Carlton sharing. It's unfortunate, I think, that didn't ever end up happening, and Carlton's character went in a very different way in the future of the Marvel Universe.
Yeah. Well, again, that goes back to people maybe working on the characters who didn't maybe have the same respect that I felt I did. But yeah, in a way, Carlton and Mike were kind of redundant. They kind of filled the same kind of role on the team in many ways. They had that same energy. That's another reason why I felt okay with killing off Mike, because I knew I could kind of slot in Carlton, and it would have the same energy, the same feeling. Yeah, it is a shame that no one continued to do that. But then again, if someone had, I probably would have been mad that I hadn't, that they got to do it instead of me. So.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's funny for years and years, and I hate to keep bringing Fabian up, but he's a very large figure in my life and my professional life. But he told me that he didn't read my New Warriors run for years and years. Like it wasn't that he didn't like it. And I didn't understand it for a long time until I was in the same position, and I felt the exact same way. Like when the New Warriors was kind of brought back for later series, I had no interest in seeing it. Like I didn't want to, and I understand. I know that Fabian, I think in recent years, did read my run, but yeah, at the time, I just you kind of don't want to see what someone else is going to do with characters, especially if you care deeply about them, because there's two ways it can go, right? Either they handle them badly, and that feels bad to you, or they handle them well, and you're jealous that they're doing it. There's really, it's
kind of a lose-lose.
It's kind of a no-win scenario. So that may be what's underneath it all, but I finally understood that, but only years later.
So have you read any of the more recent New Warriors books? Have you gotten enough distance yet?
I did read the Zeb Wells run because it was part of my research for being the lead writer on the Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2 video game, which was centered around Civil War.
Right.
So I read all the Civil War tie-ins, everything, and so that was part of it. Yeah.
That concludes part 2 of my interview with Evan Skolnick. Stay tuned for part 3 next week, and if you have any questions for a regular episode of the show, go ahead and send me an email at welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to www.welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click Submit a Question if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome-to-geektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcome-to-geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them,
Welcome to Geektown. Population, us.
Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.